and thanks to New Futures, what a wonderful organization that I think every state wishes it had, and to have such support from the Governor's Commission and from people like Tym Rourke, who's another very unique individual, I think, in our field in terms of bringing the leadership and expertise that he can bring, tying the private and public sectors together, is really unique. Unfortunately, really unique around the country, but it's a wonderful statement about your state and where you are on this issue. And I really want to thank the Institute of Politics for hosting this. What an amazing venue, bringing back a lot of memories. I'm seeing sort of Bush on the right and Clinton on the left. It's great, or the other way around. Yeah, that's right. Sometimes, but it's really nice to be here. And so I do want to engage in a conversation and take some questions. And after I think Tim and I speak, we'd like to engage in that with you. So I'm going to go rather quickly through a presentation that usually takes much longer. Most of it actually is based on my book, Reefer Sanity, that you can find online or maybe at your bookstore near here, where I go through sort of 7 myths about marijuana. And today I will go through them very, very quickly because, again, I want to get into a discussion. And I guess what I want to say to start out with is this is not going to be your typical just say no drug prevention address. It's also not going to be what's becoming more and more typical, your just say yes address when it comes to marijuana. Drug policy is complicated, and for the students in here that are studying politics and policy analysis, you know that good policy is usually found somewhere in the middle of the two extremes that we're often presented with. And frankly, I don't think it's conducive to a bumper sticker, whether the bumper sticker says legalize or lock them up. And unfortunately, that has been the way this debate has been formed over the last really several decades. And what the organization that I founded with Congressman Patrick Kennedy, who's very sorry that he couldn't join us today, we founded it so that we could have a new dialogue and debate about drug policy and specifically marijuana. So I'm just going to start with, look, you can't talk about drugs without talking about the two most prevalent ones, which really are alcohol and tobacco. And I think it's important to see just before we start getting into issues, kind of where it is in society relative to marijuana, because all we're hearing recently is, marijuana, how prevalent it is, et cetera. These are the national trends that are mirrored more or less in New Hampshire by the general population. There are about 6 times as many drinkers as there are people that smoke marijuana, about 3 to 4 times as many smokers of tobacco than use marijuana. And I think it's important to get grounding when we look at, where are we with our legal drugs that are used in a relatively common manner, and our illegal drugs, which are including marijuana, which is used a little bit less common. And so the first myth that I hear a lot about is this issue of the fact that marijuana is harmless and non-addictive. And what's interesting about this is that just like alcohol and really every other drug, it is true that most people who use marijuana will not become addicted. They'll not ruin their lives or ruin their families. That doesn't make it safe. That doesn't make it justified to be legal. It's just true that, like all drugs affect people differently. We all know the person that smoked cigarettes for 70 years and died of old age, and the person that smoked for a year and died of emphysema. So there are differences with everybody. But what we do know, what the science tells us about marijuana, is that if you start when you're 16, 1 out of every 6 people who start when they're 16 will become addicted to it. And people don't even think marijuana is addictive. That's another big myth that science has certainly disproven, that actually you can get addicted. It's not heroin withdrawal in terms of the symptoms, but there are some very prominent, especially psychological symptoms that happen. And what's so interesting about the 1 in 6 number in my mind is, oftentimes when I talk to people, they think, well, that's not that much, right? 1 in 6. I mean, what's the big deal? Most people, 5 out of 6 is the vast majority. And then I ask them, well, would you ever drink and drive? Right? Like, what are the chances? And they say, no, of course I would never drink and drive because I'm liable to kill myself or someone else, which is, I think, a good educational message we've gotten out there. It's true. And then I say, well, what do you think the chances of getting into a fatal car crash if you're drunk is? According to the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, by the way. So according to the group against this, what do you think the chances are? And usually the guesses are 1 in 2, 1 in 3, higher, lower, but usually between 1 in 2, 1 in 10. Shockingly, the answer is 1 in 500, according to Mothers Against. Now, that doesn't mean that because 499 people can drink and drive without killing somebody, that's something that we want to promote. But it just shows that when you look at sort of a number like 1 in 6, we shouldn't discount that. Now, what does that mean, 1 in 6, and what does it mean for the heavy users? Well, what we know now, and you can't see it on the screen, I don't think, but what we know now is that one of the most important studies done on drug abuse, I think, in the last 30 years has been the one on IQ and learning. And what we know is that heavy marijuana use as a teenager can lead to a permanent loss of between 6 and 8 points on the IQ scale. Now, what does that mean? Okay, that doesn't mean that everybody who smokes marijuana heavily is dumb. It doesn't mean that everybody who's ever smoked marijuana can't make something of themselves. What it does mean is that when controlling for all other factors, you increase that risk. And if you have 150 IQ, like I'm sure everybody here does, I think this state is full of them. You're a very smart lot. If you have 150 IQ and you go down to 142, you won't miss much. That's true. I mean, you're still high achieving and great. But if you're the average person in America, and the average person has 100 IQ, and you go down to 92, that has real world implications. That is the difference between getting a degree or not. That is the difference between getting a promotion or staying in the same job you've had for 30 years. And that matters. And it matters when we think about, I look around and I see the wonderful, beautiful history here, and I think about all the candidates that have come here promising sort of a new America and how we're going to build this country from the ground up as we always have, and how we're going to get better and better and better. And when I think about a country that wants to do that, but then also is going to be promoting a substance that has the effects that it can have, I see those as very two contradictory things. That on the one hand, we want to build an America that's built to last, that's competitive with the world, and on the other hand, we're going to turn a blind eye to something that some people, and if you increase the total number of users, it means more people, have major problems with. And I think one of the issues about it that, when you talk to parents about this or others, their experience with marijuana is, smoking in the dorms 30 years ago. And what's the harm? Hey, my roommate's fine, I'm fine, we got over it. And it's true, most people will get over it. But what they don't know is that the marijuana smoked 30 or 40 years ago doesn't resemble at all what the marijuana of today is. We're talking at least 5 to 10 times stronger. And actually, when you do some of these things like hash oil and that kind of thing, 80% THC, which is off the charts. These things were unheard of in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it is almost a completely different drug. And that's really why we are seeing the levels of psychosis and emergency room mentions for marijuana that we've never seen before. We didn't see in the 60s and 70s and 80s as much. It wasn't as prevalent. And that's because the marijuana was a very, very, very different drug back then. And the reason why I think the mental health community has really begun to speak out against this is because of the link with psychoses. Now, again, this is not reefer madness. This does not mean that every single user is going to go on to use heroin and that we should demonize and lock up whoever is caught with a joint in their pocket. That we don't need to go to that extreme. But I think it calls for at least a careful consideration of whatever policies we may enact that might open the doors to further addiction and use. And actually, if you compare marijuana, the third bar there from the left, in terms of its addictive nature, we know it's about as addictive as alcohol. It's not as addictive as cigarettes, heroin, or cocaine. But 15% is nothing to scoff at when you look at the other numbers with the other substances. I'm going to skip over quickly the myth about smoked marijuana as medicine, but the bottom line for that is marijuana does contain medical properties. Science has shown that. But it's also shown that we don't need to smoke, eat, or inhale raw marijuana to get those properties, the same way we would not smoke opium to get the effects of morphine. Okay, thankfully we've moved on from those days. We have a product that actually, in products that what's at least what's in it, and you're able to get it from a doctor, from your doctor, not from a doctor you pay $50 to get a quick assessment, as it is in most states. And actually, this is a wonderful area of research. I mean, there are mouth sprays and other things that are happening that do not get you high. They do not contain a lot of the same ingredients that modern herbal marijuana contains that have medical promise, and I think we should promote those. It doesn't mean we want it to be big pharma. It doesn't mean we want it to be very expensive for people. It means that if you're suffering from cancer and muscle spasms from MS, we should be able to provide you with something that has promise, and we want to do that. That's very different, though, than saying, well, Anybody that smokes marijuana, they're doing it for medical purposes. I think we need to make that big distinction. Another myth that we hear a lot about is the issue that countless people are in prison for smoking pot. So when you look at, first of all drug offenses on the state level, it's about 18% for any drug offense, cocaine, heroin, whatever, possession or trafficking. If you look at marijuana only, and that's the right, it's about 0.1 to 0.3% of people in state prison are there because they smoked marijuana. So, you know, it's this big myth that if only we were to legalize, we'll be able to, you know, release everyone in our prisons and save money. You know, if you want to reduce incarceration in this country, you don't start with marijuana. You don't even talk about the marijuana issue. It's irrelevant. You talk about, frankly, you talk about alcohol, first of all, because alcohol sends more people to prison and in terms of arrests than all drugs combined, which is something that many people don't understand or appreciate. And that's because alcohol is used much more prevalently. If you want to reduce incarceration, let's look at the core issues in our society that lead to racism in the criminal justice system for all substances. Do we really think that the inherent race issues in our criminal justice system are going to be solved if only cops can arrest people for marijuana? We really need to think that one through, especially when we talk about communities of color. When we look at alcohol, again, which is the example we're always pointed to, right? Treat it like alcohol. When we look at alcohol in communities of color, we actually see that there are 8 times as many liquor stores, and this goes for poor communities too, in poor communities or communities of color than in upper-class white communities. Now, that's not because upper-class communities don't like to drink alcohol. It's because we have an industry and a lobby that targets the folks that really can't write the $50,000 check to the treatment center. They don't have the, most likely, they don't have the support at school and the healthcare system that they need. They often don't have the support at home that they need because their parents are working more than 2 jobs. So we have to really think about, if we're truly concerned about the disaffected, what our policies will do. Because let me tell you, for alcohol, it has been an unmitigated disaster for those communities. And that's why when you do polling around this issue, and it's divided by race, it's a very stark what you see in terms of the support among communities of color. So that goes into the next myth, that the legality of alcohol and tobacco offer any justification. You know, you'll hear Bill Maher, Stephen Colbert the other day, or others talk about, hey, alcohol is legal. You know, that's a more harmful drug than anything else, and it's legal. So shouldn't we then legalize marijuana because it's not as harmful or even equally as harmful? And my response is, rather than, you know, why would we want to treat marijuana or any other substance like alcohol if we're concerned about it? Well, let's look at how we treat alcohol today. Mass advertising and promotion. And right now, there's a new marijuana lobby that's taking its cues from the tobacco industry. So we are about to, frankly, enter an era of big tobacco. And they're already using advertisements. They're already out there. In fact, I'll go forward a little bit. Alcohol and tobacco are used far greater than our other drugs, including marijuana. And these industries promote addiction and target kids. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you go home and you're 21 and over, and you go home and drink a glass of wine tonight with your dinner, and I told this to your legislature just now as well, there were about 100 of them in the room. I told them, with all due respect, if they just go home and drink a glass of wine with their dinner, they're not very important people. And what I mean by that is they're not very important people to the alcohol industry. Because addictive industries like tobacco, gambling, alcohol, etc., are not concerned with the casual user. That's not what fills their pockets. It's not what they make money from. They only make money from those people that are addicted. And that's a minority of all users, but it's enough to line their pockets. So the alcohol industry makes over 80% of its profit from the 20% of people who really should not be drinking. They're very heavy drinkers. They're bad drinkers. They're destroying their lives. They're in and out of the criminal justice system. They're burdening the healthcare system. And so that means there's an incentive to increase addiction. And that's why you have all these new marijuana companies coming up with things that, let me tell you, our parents wouldn't even understand. Edibles, candies, the brownies, the cookies, the sodas, the hash oil, the waxes. These are meant to market to young people because addictive industries don't make money off casual users. And so what's so ironic is that we see a lot of the sort of the baby boomers now, the Woodstock generation, are the ones pushing marijuana legalization, because for them, marijuana represented something very different than what it represents for most kids today, right? It represented protest, represented, going against the status quo of a government that was in an unjust war thousands of miles away. It represents all of those kinds of things from the 60s and 70s, if we read history and we even look at some of these pictures. What's ironic is that that generation who was so anti-corporation and anti-addiction in many ways, because they were anti-incorporation, they're now furnishing and opening the door to a new industry. Because the people today controlling the marijuana policy issue and the marijuana, pushing marijuana normalization, they're not the old hippies from where I went to school in Berkeley. They are the people that now actually look like me, with the suits and the short hair and the Ivy League degrees, that cut their hair and, change their shirts and are now promoting this for their own profit. They are today's big tobacco. So the question is, do we want to usher in another big tobacco? That is really the question. It's not about prisons and everything else that we hear about. It's about, are we going to make the same mistakes that we made 100 years ago with the tobacco industry that we're only learning from now? Or are we going to try and stop this in its tracks? And so when I think about marijuana, this is what I think about. I don't think about the guy with the long hair smoking a joint with his friends. I think about this. Because we already know that Marijuana Inc., we already know the multiple companies and corporations. The Wall Street Journal said themselves, the Yale MBAs are here. Think about that for a minute. We're so good in this country. We're so good at commercializing and promoting for profit, are we not? I mean, let's look at our addictive industries. Let's look at pharma and the deaths that OxyContin brought. The fact that we dispensed tens of millions more oxycodone, hydrocodone, OxyContin tablets than would ever be justified by any country in the last 10 years. And we still consume over 90% of the world's prescription drugs. Now, I don't know if that means that people in Europe don't have pain, or if it means that we're maybe doing something wrong. Let's look at the alcohol industry. I worked in Washington. Good luck trying to raise the alcohol tax and the federal alcohol tax. Do you know that today's alcohol tax is a fifth of what it was than during the Korean War? Some people in here will have no idea. Well, you're all very smart. You have 150 IQ, so you do know when the Korean War was. I had to look it up on Wikipedia the first time I heard it because I wasn't exactly sure about the dates. In the 1950s, let's put it that way. A fifth of what it was when adjusting for inflation. We have miserably regulated alcohol. And even in states that have tried to do it right, like here in New Hampshire, we're having a commission and doing it state control. Well, what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is profit maximization, whether it's for a state or a corporate, board member, who cares? The purpose is to raise revenue. And that means you better have a lot of new addicts. And then we look at big tobacco, which is my favorite of the group. And I say that in the worst way possible. We look at the tobacco industry and the connection they already have with marijuana. They have said in their memos that they are ready to pounce on this. They have the land, the marketing, the people, and they'll do it. When we look at the tobacco industry's, let's see here. When we look at the tobacco industry's papers, which I don't have here, but we see all that they have done in terms of the lies to the American people over 50 years. Many people in this room won't remember that. They weren't born yet. But in the 1990s, we almost prohibited tobacco in this country. In the late 90s, we struck a deal. They struck a deal with Congress, but essentially, they admitted to lying. And you just saw the news report from last week. They admitted about lying about everything. If you saw that, Google News this story about the tobacco execs, the people in this room who didn't live through that. Last week, they admitted everything, and they're going to be paying hundreds of billions. The question is, do we want to go through that again? Do we want to usher this new age of what essentially would be, in my mind, called big marijuana? That is really the issue. We already have groups saying that they want to become the Marlboro version of the marijuana cigarette. We have the multi-million-dollar investor groups, look it up yourselves, that are out there, whether it's Prohibition Brands, ArcView, Privateer Holdings. These aren't hippies who like to smoke joints. These are multi-million-dollar Wall Street conglomerates that are going to make a lot of money. And remember, they do not make money off of the casual user. They only make money off of the heavy user. These are the people that want to create the Anheuser-Busch of marijuana, they said. A 29-year-old in California, $10 million he raised. He's already given $1 million to groups that want to legalize marijuana. So don't think that there's a disconnection between the lobby that wants to legalize and the lobby that's making money off of users. They are often joined at the hip. And he spent $1 million of that money on lobbying last year. But he wants to create the Anheuser-Busch. He's a user. He said, I'm going to get rich. And that's what it is. It's about getting people rich and creating the next industry. We got rid of tobacco vending machines. Now we're seeing them with billboards across the country with marijuana. We have a very short memory. We fought the tobacco industry, many of you in this room, for 50 years to get rid of vending machines that were selling deadly substances, dangerous substances. Remember, you can't smoke a cigarette and overdose from it, just like you can't smoke marijuana and overdose. That doesn't make it safe. It leads to death and illness. Smoking tobacco happens to lead to lung cancer. Smoking marijuana happens to lead to things like car crashes, like emergency room visits, and probably a whole lot of other things we don't even know about yet in terms of the cancer and other connections that we haven't yet researched fully. But why would we want a marijuana vending company? Well, we already have at least 3 in this country, and they've raked in millions under medical for the last couple of years. We have, as I said, the ring pots, the pot tarts, the drinks. Okay, this isn't for the 70-year-old cancer patient. This is aimed at young people. And again, it seems like we're repeating history when we look at Joe Camel. We look at what we've done with tobacco here with marijuana. So I would just say that, alcohol and tobacco legalization teach us one thing, that there is no money in this for anyone other than the corporate industry that's going to make a lot of money from it. And if you think there's money for schools, I have a bridge to sell you. For every dollar in alcohol and tobacco tax, and this is true right here in New Hampshire, it's true across the country. These are national figures. In New Hampshire, it's the exact same ratio. For every dollar that you gain and your legislature makes and gets to say, woo, we sold this much alcohol and tobacco, look how much money we are giving back to the community. Well, they forget to tell you the flip side of it. It costs 10 in social costs. So last year, I believe it was $1.15 billion that you spent in costs related to alcohol. That was 10 times the amount of money that was gained from selling alcohol. And the last time I checked, as wonderful and beautiful an institution as this is, the public education system in New Hampshire wasn't exactly saved by the lottery. Am I wrong? That's why, that was the purpose of the lottery. Again, you're political. Go and look at what the discourse about the lottery was in this state, what the justification used by everybody who said, we don't really love gambling, but we want money. And we need money for our schools. We need to save our public education system. You will see that that was a justification. And again, I would ask the question, are we having fun yet? What has come from all of this? And why would we want to add another drug to the list of things? So now in Colorado, I'm going to end with a couple minutes, if I can, on the state of Colorado, because this is what's in the news. This is the picture you've been seeing everywhere, that we're allowing retail sales. We're going to control this. We're going to regulate it. Get it out of the hands of drug dealers. Treat it like alcohol. We're adults. They opened for business. People were waiting in line. They were very excited about it, many people. Well, a couple things that you wouldn't have read in the news as widely, but you can if you look for it. Well, we already have multiple kids going to the ER. The latest one was a 2-year-old for ingesting a pot cookie. It's legal. It was on the ground. As a character outside of it, why wouldn't a kid grab it? By the way, dozens of kids have been hospitalized in the last year there because of brownies and things like that. A marijuana store in Colorado, and I have to give him kudos for being honest, but he said that the high school senior is his ideal target customer. Now, I don't know if he was talking about the high school senior that's flunked 5 grades and is now 21. Maybe. Probably not. And the state of Colorado said they were going to do all these grandiose, wonderful things like tagging plants and being responsible. They kind of didn't get around to those things. They still sold it anyway. And in fact, if you go to reddit.com, which of course is the most popular website if you're under 34, front page of the internet, multiple postings about ways that people should smuggle marijuana out of Colorado to neighboring states. Remember, this was one thing that they said, nobody's going to be able to do that. We're going to regulate this. The point is we get a lot of promises with these things, with all policies. And this is another one that in the beginning I could see might sound attractive. Hey, it's no worse than alcohol. We can maybe make some money. Why not? We don't want to throw people in prison. The reality is something very, very different than that. So I don't think our choices are between legalization on the one hand and prohibition or incarceration on another. This is not a stump speech for the war on drugs. It's not a stump speech for private prison industrial complex in this country. This is not a stump speech for the lobby that wants to continue to imprison people of color. Let me be very clear about that. But it is a discussion about, do we really think we're going to be addressing those issues with legalizing marijuana as opposed to maybe something wild and crazy like investing in schools? Or something as wild and crazy as increasing the number so that more than 1 in 10 people, as it is in New Hampshire, who need treatment get it? Maybe we can try for 2 out of 10, maybe. You know, it would double at least. Something as wild and crazy as let's look at the structural issues that lead people to become drug dealers and risk their lives, the structural issues that are related to the fact that foreign countries like places in Mexico where they have cartels has not had a functioning educational or healthcare system since the founding of their country. Maybe those things might be a place to start. It's going to be hard. It's much easier to legalize and say we did our part. But maybe we should start with the more fundamental things as opposed to starting the next tobacco industry, which is exactly what we would be opening this up to. And, you know, when you look at Colorado and Washington, these are places that said they were going to do it responsible. You know, this is during the campaign, they said, we are going to make sure kids have to be ID'd for their marijuana. And if you're not 21, you don't get it. That's the way we're going to control this, you know, because as we know, kids don't have access to that other drug that you have to be 21 for, alcohol. And right now, the lobby there that spent $5 million to pass this, if you want to talk about money in politics, some of you are interested in politics, look at the money in politics behind this movement. Look at how much money was spent in Washington and Colorado to have any kind of equal playing time. Look at the money spent nationally to create a marijuana industry and to have new laws as a result. Look at who is funding Alaska, New Hampshire, and Oregon to be the next states to legalize. You'll be surprised. It's not the medical association. It's not teachers. It's not scientists. It's not parents. It's a small lobby that is growing every day that, frankly, many of them they see as their end goal is legalizing all drugs. Not all of them. And so I just think we can have something better and do better than either of these two extremes of legalization or incarceration, because legalization means commercialization. Unless we're ready to have a constitutional convention here, maybe we are, to repeal the First Amendment, commercial speech is free speech, another thing to look at, as has been defined by multiple courts. The First Amendment protects free speech. It protects corporate speech. So good luck trying to regulate an industry. We haven't been able to do it with any other industry that sells addictive substances. I don't see why we'd be able to do it with this one. It doesn't mean our policy is perfect now. It doesn't mean we throw people in prison. It doesn't mean we say we have a war on drugs and that's it, go home. It doesn't mean we let cancer patients suffer a long, painful death. It doesn't mean we need to throw people and not give them a chance to get a job in the future if they have an arrest record. Let's not do that. Let's fix those things with smart policies. But let's not go over to the other extreme of legalization. So I'm going to end there and pass the podium to Tym to talk more about sort of some state trends and what we're seeing here in New Hampshire. And then I look forward to a robust discussion. Thank you so much for listening to me. Actually.
Excuse me all for just a second while I get myself set up. Just going going to try and get back to the desktop. I have a lot of things to a lot of people, but tech savvy, I apparently am not. You want to get up there? So, first of all, I want to just thank both New Futures and the Institute of Politics for hosting today's event. I very typically sit over there, so I am humbled to be on the stage, both with Kevin and with the history of what the Institute provides. That's perfect.
Yours up here?
Yeah, because mine's saved to the desktop somewhere. So here we go. I think this is it. Oh, I'm over to the right. Thank you for keeping me in line. So really lovely to have a few minutes, and I do want to be brief so that we can begin our conversation, wanting to focus a little bit on taking the national context that Kevin has laid out and talking a little bit about what's happening in New Hampshire literally as we speak, and maybe thinking while we're talking about marijuana specifically, thinking about just drug policy in general and how the state of New Hampshire is wrestling with this, and hopefully some ways that I think the nation could be in this conversation in a much more genuine way. So first off, again, my name is Tym Rourke. I'm the Director of Substance Use Grant Making and Strategic Initiatives at the Charitable Foundation. We are one of the largest community foundations in the country. We have about $500 million in assets. We are unique in that we have a fund, a portfolio of funds focused on substance use disorders given to us by a donor here in the state of New Hampshire who is really concerned about alcohol and other drugs and their impact on New Hampshire citizens. It is about 10% of our grant making. We make about $3 million a year in grants. And our donor's interest in particular at the outset of his gift was policy and advocacy. Understanding that as a public health concern, we really needed to be paying more attention to the power of policy to really impact change in a state like ours. So that is my day job, and it is through my role at the Charitable Foundation that at the governor's request I serve as chair of the state's Commission on Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse, which is made up of members of both houses of the legislature, the governor's office, agency commissioners from most of New Hampshire's state agencies, as well as some treatment and prevention professionals, folks in recovery and community, folks concerned around substance abuse. So just to give you a context of some of the structures that drive a little bit about New Hampshire. So I want to just talk a little bit about what we know and set the context. And, you know, Kevin did a great job of talking about some of these national trends. There are ways in which New Hampshire is unique in the most negative sense of the word. We are often promoted as the healthiest state in the nation. It's the most livable state for children. I grew up here, but as a parent, as a new parent, it's one of the reasons I came back. But when you peel back the onion on what that means, when it comes to substance use disorders, we are not. We have the second highest per capita usage of marijuana by adolescents, 12 to 17-year-olds in the country. We lead the country in per capita addiction, and we have remained, when you look at surveys like the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, whether you want to talk about marijuana, alcohol, prescription drugs, we've always been in the top 5. But in marijuana very specifically, we are second. And this sort of bears out again by age group. You see that in there. I should also note that while we're talking about youth, we need to include young adults as well. And you can see how our rates across the age spectrums are largely higher than the national average for young people. When we talk about addiction and the likelihood that a young person will begin using substances, we talk about something called perception of risk. Does the young person believe that the use of a substance or a risky behavior would have a negative consequence? What we want is a high perception of risk. Because if someone doesn't believe that it's risky, they are more likely to engage in that risk behavior, whether it's substance abuse or another public health concern. So we are concerned in New Hampshire because here our perception of risk is low. And I can tell you anecdotal stories of prevention advocates in communities that have begun to have conversations with young people since we passed our therapeutic cannabis bill in New Hampshire last year, who are asking questions of, I don't understand why there's an issue with marijuana because I understand it cures cancer. So we know that this is indicative of what we are concerned about, a continued upward trend in rates of marijuana use in New Hampshire, so that very soon, without some significant changes in how we manifest our drug control policy in New Hampshire, we expect marijuana use to perhaps surpass alcohol in young people, which would be a pretty sorry distinction for the state. There is the Huffington Post has this lovely habit since Colorado and Washington's legalization efforts kicked in, that every so often they post a flash article on their app that says, an update on the number of people who died from marijuana. When you click on it, it's a picture of pandas, and they tell you no one's died. And in the medical marijuana conversation here in the legislature, again, marijuana's never killed anybody. Now, mind you, two things. One, in the early days of tobacco has never killed anybody. But in New Hampshire, we actually know that's not true. This is a graph that looks at traffic fatalities, and you can see that since 2008, 52% of traffic fatalities have involved a driver under the influence of marijuana. In the last 2 years alone, that's 23 deaths directly attributed to marijuana use and someone getting behind the wheel of a car. So the idea that marijuana doesn't potentially cause death and isn't related to that is just flat out inaccurate. I would also comment that I think a dialogue that equates death or lack thereof as the only reason that something is considered safe is very nearsighted when we look at some of the other damage it does, as Kevin described. But while we can talk about social ills, and Kevin alluded to this, we've been focusing in New Hampshire and across the country, not just in marijuana, but in other arenas of drug and alcohol abuse. There's the social cost, but there's also economic drivers. There's economic cost. We've had economic costs to the state of New Hampshire around the overconsumption of alcohol. Kevin alluded to this, that it's $1.15 billion a year. It is largely borne by the state and small business, lost worker productivity, folks who are out of the job because they're either home struggling with their own disorder or they're caregiving for someone who is. We've been talking around conversations and tables around economic development in our state, particularly in our North Country. We've actually had businesses tell us, you know what, we don't have a problem with a lack of jobs. I got plenty of jobs. We got plenty of jobs in the trades and in construction in New Hampshire, but we have a population that can't take those jobs because they failed drug tests. So this is a huge hit to our economy already. And to note, this is when this survey was done and this analysis was done, this is the overconsumption of alcohol by adults. So this number does not take into account the economic costs of youth alcohol consumption for reasons that if Brian Gottlieb were here, he would probably be able to explain to you. This is largely also the cost borne by overconsumption by men, because for a variety of reasons, cost analysis around women in the state of New Hampshire was a little challenging to get at. So this number is conservative, and we're only talking about alcohol. If we were to talk about substance use in general, that number would be huge. All of this is to say a policy that would promote further access to a mind-altering substance is not in New Hampshire's economic best interest, whether or not the safety concerns, the health concerns might move the conversation. The other piece is while we rank highest in use, we are lowest, almost, in the ability for someone who does develop a disorder to get help. So this is a chart from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that looks at treatment access across the country. And you will see the dark red line is us. And the only state to the left, and left is bad here, is Texas, which means that if you are an addict in the state of New Hampshire, we estimate, again, if you think about 10% of our population, about 130,000 people, we can treat about 6,000 of them. The rest have no access. And while we have some of the finest addiction treatment centers in the country, the finest co-occurring addiction treatment centers in the country, here in the state and across immediate borders, they're full. They're full. So we have high rates of use. We have a treatment system that is so anemic we cannot meet current demand. And I think that all begs the question of how do we look at this policy issue? Because ultimately, it's a public health issue. We need to be, and I talked about this morning, as a live free or die state where liberty and personal freedoms are paramount and becoming more so a part of the dialogue around how we make our decisions, we need to recognize that for every conversation around the personal freedom that should come with the ability to use a drug of their own choice, that the idea that that does not have impact on their neighbors, their parents, their families, the broader community, our economy, your wallets, it's fallacy. So again, we have, because of the structure of the state of New Hampshire, where we have a governor's commission made up of state agencies and legislators, from a policy perspective, New Hampshire is really well positioned to have the kind of dialogue around drug and alcohol policy reform that Kevin is talking about, and that Kevin talks about in his book and in his talks across the country. We have state strategy documents that look at not just what legislators need to know, what law enforcement needs to know, but trying to create environments where everybody comes around a table to think about what's best for New Hampshire. There is a document, for folks that want more New Hampshire-specific data, I would just drive you to this. The Department of Health and Human Services, these two documents are state plans that New Hampshire uses to guide its drug and alcohol policy work. This document, the Department of Health and Human Services has been putting out issue briefs on data around various substances in New Hampshire about every other month. The marijuana document came out about a month ago. I'll give a link at the end of this presentation, because if nothing else, we need to be cognizant of the noise that is coming in the fervor of legalization that's happening in the two states that are just at the beginning of their experimentation. And remember that good policy should be driven by good data. And so there's really good data. We're blessed in New Hampshire with a lot of data about who's using and why and where, to know that we need to think very, very carefully before we jump in to something that might have been a little premature, to say the least, in a couple of other states. And so that document's available. The last piece that I will say is that there is a bill traveling through the legislature in New Hampshire right now, House Bill 492, that would legalize marijuana in the state of New Hampshire. There's a saying that I learned when I grew up that I talked about this morning around boundaries. I think I was taught it when I was 8, and that is that your rights end where my nose begins. We have a drug that has a mind-altering impact, and for some there is no harm. For others there is a lot of harm. Yesterday in Concord, New Hampshire, we had a driver hit a pedestrian, and that driver was under the influence of prescription drugs. That pedestrian, fortunately, is alive, although it sounds like the recovery for that pedestrian is going to be quite lengthy. Now, again, any number of traffic fatalities have even though we talk about prescription drug abuse, you may have noticed on that earlier slide that prescription drug abuse is not the dominant drug that is driving traffic fatalities in this state. It's marijuana. So as we have this conversation, I think New Hampshire is a place where we pride ourselves when we make policy decisions in New Hampshire. I think we are at our best, whatever the policy is, bringing all sides to the table and trying to figure out what the middle ground is, recognizing that individual freedom is inherently tied to the ability to come together and take care of one another. The idea of a policy effort that would produce a perceived sense of liberty while at the same time doing damage to our citizens at a rate even worse than it is right now, which is considered by many from the governor on down as an untenable crisis that threatens the nature of our very economy and quality of life. It's just counterintuitive. So I think we think that the work that Kevin is doing, the work that's happening around marijuana policy, that this is a state that we hope is going to slow down and is going to take a look at all sides of this issue, recognizing the tensions that come with that more individualized live free or die spirit, with the fact that the damage that this could do, may not be able to be undone. And I would just end by highlighting one other example that I was meant to include in my brief remarks, which is the conversation around how this ties or does not to alcohol policy. In the state of New Hampshire, we are a control state, which means that if you drive from here to Concord, you will not stop, at least right now, although it's changing. You can't get gas on the highway. There's no Starbucks. There is a state liquor store. It is the size of a football field. We are in the business of selling liquor, and we do a very, very good job of it. Now, happy to have the conversation in our discussion. There are benefits from a prevention standpoint of being a control state. Do not let me mischaracterize it. However, in 2000, this state made a decision that, well, if we're going to be in this business, we probably should put some money into the prevention and treatment to mitigate the damage we know this drug causes. And so something was established called the Alcohol Fund. It's 5% of gross profits from the sale of liquor in our state liquor stores. That was in the year 2000. It has been fully funded once, in the year that it was passed. Every year since then, either the governor or the legislature or a combination thereof have zeroed out that fund so that no money from the sale of alcohol goes into it, and then have, if they felt so inclined, replaced it with a modest, small amount of general fund resources, which means, and for folks who don't know, the alcohol fund was what we would call a dedicated fund. So once it's dedicated, it's there and you can't touch it, except to use it for its purpose, unless it's suspended. Once you put in general fund money, not only can you put in whatever you want, whether or not it follows the formula, but you can also take it whenever you want. And it has continued to leave the issue of addiction in New Hampshire one of the most underfunded in the country. We are 49th in per capita expenditures on alcohol and other drug abuse. And I share this because when, very quickly, and it happens with gambling, certainly, and it happens with this idea of marijuana and regulating and taxing marijuana. Well, we will take a percentage of those proceeds, and don't worry, we'll put it in the law enforcement, we'll put it into treatment to make sure that people... Now, not only does that sound a little sketchy, we'll build a business so that we could treat the people who will get sick because of our business, but we have no history of following through on that kind of commitment in the state of New Hampshire. The only example of that kind of mechanism is the alcohol fund, and it's never been followed through on. There are active conversations where we hope that that will change, but today that fund should be $8.5 million for substance abuse treatment and prevention. It is 1.7. So I think we hope that the policy conversation that will continue in New Hampshire is one that pays more attention, pays attention to what is happening in these states that have perhaps early adopted too soon, but that also we are able to conduct a conversation around marijuana and drug policy in the way that New Hampshire does best. Bringing together those disparate sides, the legalizers and the prohibitionists, and put them at a table and move in a third way, which is that way that is more sensible, more data-driven, and recognizes the tension between, yes, individual rights, but protecting the public health and protecting the public safety. So with that, we'll open it up for questions and discussion, and thank you.